Good afternoon. My name is Victor Zonana. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Brooklyn Law School, and I'd like to welcome you all to Brooklyn Law School. This, as you know, is, some of you may know, is our 100th anniversary. We have been celebrating our centennial for the past year through a series of events that started last September with a convocation that was attended, and the keynote speaker was Chief Judge Judith Kaye of the New York Court of Appeals. We have had a lot of academic-type programs in the past year, including symposia on psychology and the jury, a symposia on international taxation. We have one forthcoming on DNA. We have also been very fortunate in attracting some very prominent speakers to our centennial celebration, including last November, Justice Ruth Ginsburg. Today we have another one of our showcase events, and we're delighted that you're all here to welcome Professor Chomsky. Before I turn over the program to my colleague Larry Solon, who will introduce Professor Chomsky more properly than I have been introducing him, I'd just like to say a couple of words about the two centers at Brooklyn Law School that are co-sponsoring this particular event. The event is co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of International Business Law. This is a center that was started at the law school back in 1987. It is devoted to a study of international business law and policy issues. It has been in existence, as I said, for about 12 years or 13 years, and has been headed by Professor Roberta Carmel and Professor Arthur Pinto, both of whom are here today. The other sponsor or co-sponsor of this program is the Edward V. Spare Public Interest Fellowship Program. This is a program that has been at the law school for about 16 years now, promoting public interest work, doing good in the best traditions of the legal profession, and it provides legal services to underrepresented constituencies. We focus on current issues in public interest law, and the program has been headed for the past 15 or 16 years by our very own Professor Elizabeth Schneider, who is also here and has been doing an outstanding job with this program and this center. The last person I would like to introduce is Professor Solon, who has been with us for at least 5 years now, I think. Larry is a member of the Center for the Study of Law, Language, and Cognition. This was a center that was formed 4 years ago together with Professor Winter and Professor Solon to focus on some of the psychology, cognitive sciences such as psychology, linguistics that have a dramatic impact on the implications for the law at both the practical and theoretical level. So without further ado, let me turn the program over to Professor Solon, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. Noam Chomsky is Institute Professor at MIT, where he's taught since 1955, and he teaches in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy. He's done important scholarly work in a number of areas, but is especially known for his important contributions to the study of language and cognition. In fact, it's not unusual to hear of the Chomskyan Revolution, a term which is an accurate reflection of radical changes in these areas of study that his work has brought about. He's here today, though, to talk about another set of issues that have been of great concern to him over the years, the current state of the world political economic order. He's written and lectured widely about contemporary issues and international affairs, bringing to his audience's attention many ways in which the rich and powerful have set up governmental and economic structures that have disadvantaged the many. He is a true fighter for the right of people to live their lives free and with dignity. And among his recent books on these issues are Powers and Prospects and Profit Over People. Well, in recognition of all these accomplishments, Chomsky's received honorary degrees from more than 20 universities around the world, including here in the United States, Harvard, the University of Massachusetts, the University of Chicago, and Swarthmore College, among a number of others. He's also the recipient of many prestigious prizes, including, to just name two, the Kyoto Prize in Basic Sciences and the Helmholtz Medal. Now, Professor Chomsky is a prodigious writer, as most of you know, and just to give you a personal anecdote, last year I went to a bookstore looking for his most recent book on language called New Horizons in the Study of Language. And when I asked the salesman if they had Chomsky's new book, he consulted the computer screen and then looked at me condescendingly and said, "Which one? There were 6. It's a pleasure to introduce Noam Chomsky.
Thanks, Larry. There are 3 topics that are mentioned in the announcement for this talk: sovereignty, democracy, and markets. They interweave in complicated ways. With respect to each of them, there are conceptions that are accepted rather widely in Western elite opinion, although not elsewhere, and they merit a good deal of skepticism, I think. I'll try to outline some of the reasons for this judgment. In brief, the theses I want to consider, which are familiar to you, are that a new era is opening in world affairs in which sovereignty takes second place to human rights, and sovereignty is succumbing to the spread of market democracy, which is another welcome development. Here I'm understanding sovereignty to mean that state decisions reflect internal power arrangements rather than external forces, obviously a matter of degree with many dimensions. To the extent that a state is democratic, the sovereignty becomes popular sovereignty. That is, the right of people to make their own choices and follow their own course. State sovereignty is not a value in itself. It has to be evaluated in terms of its human consequences. Popular sovereignty, on the other hand, is a value in itself, though of course it can easily conflict with other values, an inescapable human predicament. However, state sovereignty is like economic growth or trade or public spending and a wide range of other choices that have to ask what the consequences are. It's neither good nor bad in itself. That's already contrary to conventional theses that's mentioned. Well, let's consider the first thesis, that the international community has at last come to recognize that sovereignty may be trumped by human rights. So it's quite a chorus about that as the millennium came to an end. Prominent intellectuals are hailing their own countries, these are all quotes now, as the enlightened states that are dedicated to principles and values for the first time in history, and are now willing to use force to bring peace and justice to the defiant, the indolent, and the miscreant, the disorderly elements of the world. The virtuous states are led by an idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity, which is now at the height of its glory, having entered a noble phase with a saintly glow in its traditional service to America's mission. This is just a tiny sample drawn from the most respected sources, distinguished legal commentators, foreign affairs, historians, New York Times, and so on. Well, a review of the celebratory rhetoric that greeted the new millennium reveals some interesting features. One of them is the lack of any effort to demonstrate that the leaders of the international community are dedicated to human rights. You might try a literature search and find anyone who tries to give some support to that doctrine. Can't find anything. Apparently it's true by definition, just as membership in the club of enlightened states is conferred a priori. It's given, you don't have to pass any membership requirements. So, for example, it's true by definition, without argument, that the United States is the supreme enlightened state, while its chosen enemies are defiant, miscreant and disorderly. Cuba, for example, which deserves neither dignity nor respect, Jeffrey Robertson declares in his recent study, Crimes Against Humanity. But Washington does deserve dignity and respect. In fact, ought to claim that while it's subjecting Cuba to large-scale terror and economic warfare for the last 40 years. Apparently, Washington also deserves dignity and respect when it tightened the stranglehold on Cuba after the Cold War ended. It's not easy to reconcile with the alleged reasons for the stranglehold, but that passed in silence. In this case, even effectively barring food and medicines, which is unique among sanctions in the world. It also stood alone against virtually the entire world while rejecting any international review of these procedures, even by the World Trade Organization. And perhaps it's even leading the international community by doing so. Well, some problems seem to arise about the conventions, but they pass without notice, and if they're occasionally mentioned, they're dismissed with frivolous evasions. A review of the literature on this topic also reveals that we are, and it reveals very clearly, in fact, that we're entitled to disregard the reasons for the assault, that it began in March 1959. That's 2 months after the overthrow of the U.S.-backed dictator, when the National Security Council secretly advised that the new government must be overthrown. That decision was taken formally, again in secret, in March 1960, several months after planes based in Florida bombed Cuba. That's initiating decades of international terrorism. The reasons for all of this are explained quite lucidly in the internal record, which was released a couple of years ago. For example, in the report of John F. Kennedy's Latin American advisors, who described, they reviewed the situation in the hemisphere, of course discussed Cuba, and here's what they said. They said Cuba is a threat because of the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into one's own hands, a serious problem when the distribution of land and other forms of national wealth greatly favors the propertied classes, and the poor and underprivileged, stimulated by the example of the Cuban Revolution, are now demanding opportunities for a decent living. The threat, they go on to say, is heightened by the fact that the Soviet Union hovers in the wings, flourishing large development loans and presenting itself as the model for achieving modernization in a single generation. That's the famous Soviet threat. Tremble before. I'm quoting Arthur Schlesinger, historian, was Kennedy's leading Latin American advisor. This is Schlesinger's report to the incoming president of the conclusions of Kennedy's Latin American mission, and extended with other comments by Schlesinger. These concerns that I've just quoted will be completely familiar to anyone who's paid attention to the internal planning record throughout the Cold War, going back to its origins in 1918, and also familiar to anybody who knows this record will be the discrepancy between the actual concerns expressed internally and the public rhetoric that enters the canon and becomes the presupposed truth for respectable discussion. There's no evidence that I know of any changes since then, apart from tactical adjustments. But the point I'm making here is that we don't really have to inquire into any of these matters according to the canon, because everything's true by definition, and therefore they're all unmentioned. None of this is mentioned as we lead the world into a brand new era in human affairs. And again, I'd invite you to check to see whether this is an exaggeration. Find some mention. I could save you some trouble by giving you the 2 or 3 places where you can find it. One of the books that Larry mentioned. The case of Cuba also sheds light on the thesis, now highly regarded thesis, that the enlightened states are at last willing to disregard international law in pursuit of their higher ideals. That's another welcome current development. You should recall that it was in connection with Cuba, U.S. actions against Cuba, that Dean Acheson instructed the American Association for International Law almost 40 years ago that, quoting, the propriety of a U.S. response to a challenge to the power, position, and prestige of the United States is not a legal issue. We talk about international law in order to gild our positions with an ethos derived from very general moral principles which have affected legal doctrine, as to be said with appropriate cynicism to get the point. Acheson explained elsewhere. This contemporary stance, which is, as far as I know, is close to exceptionless, certainly goes back to the earliest days of the post-war period, and it's no recent innovation. In fact, it traces right back to the origins of the Westphalian system, including the unique status of the enlightened states and their right of intervention in pursuit of lofty goals by definition. Some of the reasons why Stephen Krasner, in his recent scholarly history of sovereignty, refers to the concept as organized hypocrisy, plausibly. Now, there are a few qualifications that should be made. One of them is that the veil is very easily lifted by outsiders. So Thomas Jefferson, for example, could readily conclude in 1812 that we believe no more in Bonaparte's fighting merely for the liberties of the seas than in Great Britain's fighting for the liberties of mankind. We recognize that both are driven by narrow interests of power and resource, and that the rhetoric is for calming down the public and trying to induce others to go along. Today's rhetorical stance elicits similar reactions outside the circle of enlightenment, and when that is noted, which is very rare, that reaction is taken to provide more evidence of the unworthiness of the defiant and the miscreant and the disorderly who don't recognize our magnificence. Reaction of Britain and France to the colonies was quite the same at the time of Jefferson. The second qualification is also in order. That is that there have always been a handful of dissidents among the conquerors. For example, Adam Smith, who harshly condemned what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, particularly focusing his condemnation against England, which was destroying India at the time he wrote, as he bitterly described. Or Richard Cobden, a century later, one of the very few people who actually believed in free trade ever. He also denounced Britain's crimes in India, and he expressed his hope that the national conscience will be aroused to timely atonement and reparation, and will put an end to the deeds of violence and injustice which have marked every step of our progress in India. Of course, he hoped in vain. What followed were new deeds of violence and injustice, along with continued outpouring of self-congratulation, even on the part of people of great honor and integrity who were in a position to have made a difference, facts that have very clear lessons for today. Perhaps the most instructive case is John Stuart Mill, who indeed is a figure of unusual integrity and intelligence, and also the author of the classic essay on humanitarian intervention in 1859. Mill was critical of the prevailing view in England that the world's hegemonic power should not intervene, quoting now, unless its safety is threatened or any of its interests endangered. That's what today is called the Bush-Rice-Powell doctrine. And Mill criticized that from regarded as self-serving doctrine. He criticized it from the kind of left humanist internationalist point of perspective, and his reasons were, he said, that this doctrine doesn't give enough weight to the fact that, quoting now, that Britain is a novelty in the world. It has no crass notions or aggressive designs, and always acts only in the service of others, desiring no benefit to itself at the expense of others. Its policies are always blameless and laudable. But just as is the case today, others don't really comprehend the nobility of purpose of the world's moral leader. It says even Europeans attribute base motives to the British, not realizing that they seek only fraternal equality with the whole human race. However, he goes on, England should not be deterred by the fact that it's held up to obloquy on the continent. The thoughts of others merit no attention. And then he asks, when do we do it? When would intervention be right and just? He recognizes that this isn't an easy question. In fact, he regards it as one of the hardest questions of ethical and political philosophy. And he pursues the question perceptively, as always, and he finds a criterion, namely, intervention is permissible against barbarians, those with a low degree of civilization, whose minds are not capable of comprehending rules, and therefore need the protection of a civilized power, particularly, of course, the noblest among them. So Mill continues, it's hopelessly misguided to criticize what was being done in Algeria by France, which at that moment was exterminating the indigenous population, the words of the French Minister of War, the highest motives. And of course, the British in India are immune from criticism. And Mill goes on to discuss this. To illustrate, he singles out British actions in Oud, which was recently annexed, where Britain had just repressed the rebellion that in the West is called the Indian Mutiny. Mill was actually writing this right in the middle of the public exposure of Britain's horrendous atrocities in suppressing the rebellion, and just at the moment when Britain was embarking on the Second Opium Wars, which were also bitterly condemned by parliamentary dissidents. Mill was an official of the East India Company, and he surely knew of the central role of Britain's enormous international narco-trafficking enterprise for sustaining the British imperial system that had also been discussed by his father, James Mill, 25 years earlier. The annexations in India, which he applauded, were part of Britain's effort to ensure that it would gain a monopoly both of production and distribution of opium in this case, in order to somehow force its way into the Chinese market. The British understood 1860 they couldn't do this by trade because Chinese production was superior to theirs. But if they could force opium in, maybe they could break through the Chinese barriers. And in fact, this immense narco-trafficking enterprise that financed the British fleet, that financed British administrative costs in India, that the opium was being produced, sufficient to cover the purchases of U.S. cotton for Lancashire mills. In fact, it was like a central part of the whole British imperial system. Of course, Mill knew all of this. He must also have been aware of the impact of the free trade policies that Britain had imposed on India by force, of course, leaving misery that hardly finds a parallel in the history of commerce, as the bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. It's the observation of the director of the Honorable Company, of which Mill was a leading defender and also administrator. This simply endorsed the conclusions of British Royal Inquiry Commissions right at the same time. The policies were also undermining Indian industry and commerce, severely damaging the ecology, and turning one of the world's leading commercial and industrial centers into an impoverished agrarian nation. Well, that's the classic essay on intervention, foundation of the modern principles of humanitarian intervention, and it's a good choice in my opinion. but it should be read, not just honored. No, it's not my intention to criticize Mill, not in the least. He's one of the most impressive figures of modern thought. And it's precisely for that reason that I think we should attend quite closely to what he says in this classic essay and its lessons for today, which I think should be obvious without any comment. Well, another contemporary bow to the Westphalian tradition is the concept international community. The concept refers to the United States and whoever goes along with it. Excluded from the international community are the governments of what's called the South, like G77. They're called now 133 countries, accounting for about 80% of the world's population. Their status was revealed very clearly last April at the South Summit held in Havana. That was the most important meeting in their history. It was the first meeting they'd ever had at the level of heads of state. And they issued a long, detailed declaration, the Declaration of the South Summit, which was about sovereignty, democracy, and markets. It was highly critical of Western doctrine and practice, quite specific. The declaration was not reported in the United States, apart from a few disparaging phrases saying that these people are sort of like the guys throwing rocks in Seattle. Again, by definition, not necessary to look at what they said to reach that conclusion. Well, again, that's standard practice, and it's understandable within the framework of the conventional assumption. These assumptions also enable us to understand an apparent paradox about sovereignty and intervention in human rights. It's not easy to find, but there are a few cases when governments actually did use military force to terminate enormous crimes against humanity. I know of only two striking examples in the post-World War II era. One is Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia, which expelled Pol Pot just at the time when his atrocities were peaking. The second is India's invasion of East Pakistan a few years earlier. But these actions did not open a grand new era in which human rights trumps sovereignty. And we should ask, why not? Well, for those who've had a good education and have internalized the conventions, the answer to that question is quite clear. The agents of these actions did not belong to the international community. Furthermore, they were harshly condemned and punished by the leader of the international community by extreme measures in the case of Vietnam, as the United States turned to open support for Pol Pot and for a Chinese invasion to punish Vietnam for the crime of having ended Khmer Rouge atrocities, also imposing severe sanctions. Pretty much the same, though not quite that harsh in the case of India. So obviously these actions couldn't have opened a new era, and they didn't. And the issue doesn't have to be discussed. It's so obvious, again, for anyone who's had the benefit of a proper education. If you can escape those curls, history and common sense seem to me to provide ample reason for at least skepticism about the millennial chorus of self-adulation, but they don't demonstrate that it's incorrect. And in fact, if it has even a particle of truth, it would be extremely important, a ray of encouragement and not such pleasant times. In short, familiarity does not in itself suffice to breed contempt. Also necessary to show that, to reject the conclusion that maybe there's been some sudden revolutionary break from traditional practice and rhetoric. So you have to look. You have to evaluate the claim. And in order to do so, you have to sort of hear about the logic of the situation. You have to begin by distinguishing two quite different questions. One is the question at hand. Are we really entering a grand new era, as is proclaimed by those who declare themselves its leaders? That's one question. A second and totally separate question is whether this or that action is justified. The chosen example in elite Western discourse is invariably the bombing of Serbia. Well, it's repeatedly been emphasized that these are completely different questions, and that the first one, overarching claims about the Grand New Era, those are by far the most important. And these very elementary observations have consistently been misinterpreted in quite revealing ways, if you think it through. In the West, that is. Outside, it's taken to be obvious. In the West, the very rare efforts to assess the broader New Era claims are commonly, in fact, to my knowledge, invariably, reinterpreted as if the project is some kind of diatribe against the NATO bombing or similar evasion. No matter how emphatically it's stressed that these are two entirely different questions, and that the topic addressed is the first and most important one, namely the validity of the grandiose claims. That cannot be understood. And the consistent blindness of Western intellectuals on this is, again, understandable. On the tacit principles that I already mentioned, our leaders are enlightened and honorable by definition, so therefore the more general question about the new era can't even be posed. It's like asking whether 2 plus 2 is 5. Can't pose the question, and therefore any attempt to explore it, any apparent attempt to explore it, must be some kind of disguised diatribe against Western actions, and one that the West picks, Western intellectuals pick, is the bombing of Serbia. Well, easy enough to illustrate case after case, but let me just take one example, which is quite typical, except that it has an unusual degree of caution and care, and it comes from a prominent and properly respected source, in this case, Human Rights Watch. So have a look at its World Report for the year 2000. The opening sentence states that sovereignty loomed less large in 1999 as an obstacle to stopping and redressing crimes against humanity, as the international community displayed a new willingness to deploy troops to stop crimes against humanity, trends that mark the beginning of a new era for the human rights movement, which can at last count on governments to use their police powers to enforce human rights laws. The reference, of course, is not to Vietnam and India, but to the enlightened states. 2 cases are mentioned, Kosovo and East Timor, and it is presupposed without discussion that Western actions in both cases were noble in intent, a fact that is so self-evident that they even opened a new era for the human rights. Well, keep the logic in mind. To demonstrate nobility of intent, it does not suffice to argue that the actions were legitimate. So the actions of India and Vietnam may well have been legitimate, but in these cases we adopt the stance of a rational observer, and we recognize that much more than that is needed to establish humanitarian intent. Well, that question is not addressed in the Human Rights Watch report. It is almost, as far as I know, entirely evaded in the huge current literature on humanitarian intervention, check and see. It's just simply taken for granted, without inquiry or argument, that in both the case of Kosovo and East Timor, Western actions were guided by noble intent, even if they may have been flawed in practice, and they therefore open a new era. Well, the Human Rights Watch report does partially deal with this. It addresses the charges of what it calls critics who challenge the humanitarian interventions in Kosovo and East Timor on the grounds of selectivity. Notice again that the crucial question is big. To demonstrate that something's a humanitarian intervention, it's not suffice that the agents so declare. That's ritual accompaniment of the use of force carries no information. One has to determine whether this ritual accompaniment happens to be correct in this case. Easy to do. No less interesting than the begging of the crucial question is the criticism that the Human Rights Watch constructs and quite rightly rejects. The question of what should have been done in Kosovo and East Timor, or anything like it, that has to be evaluated in the light of specific circumstances, exactly as in the case of, say, Vietnam and India. The question of selectivity doesn't even arise, in this connection at least. It does arise in a different connection, namely with regard to the overarching and far more important question of whether we're indeed entering a new era under the guidance of the self-described international community. That's an elementary point, and it's been made over and over, and it's consistently misinterpreted. Apparently, it cannot be understood, again, in this case. Well, Human Rights Watch continues its discussion of selectivity in the following way. These unnamed critics to whom they are responding ask, why intervene in Kosovo and East Timor and not in Angola or Colombia or Chechnya or Sudan? Well, as a criticism of policies in Kosovo and East Timor, the question is so silly that it doesn't even merit a response. But the question would be sensible if it were framed differently. What are the reasons for the selective decision? Well, if you raise that question, you're back facing the broader and more important question. Is it true that we're witnessing the dawn of a new era in which great powers are dedicated to human rights for the first time in history, as Human Rights Watch and others declare, now willing to disregard sovereignty, the UN Charter, and other impediments? Unlike the senseless question that Human Rights Watch and innumerable others construct and easily refute, this question is sensible and important, but it's typically evaded in the manner that I just illustrated. There certainly are legitimate questions about what should be done in cases that Human Rights Watch mentions. So, for example, should the U.S. intervene in Colombia? Well, as soon as you ask that question, it's clear that it's kind of odd. The United States is intervening in Colombia, in fact, massively, and it's been doing so for many years. As Human Rights Watch has eloquently documented, the intervention has been in support of the worst human rights violators in the hemisphere, who were responsible for the overwhelming majority of atrocities in Colombia, which reached a level of over one reported massacre a day in early 1999, adding another 300,000 or so people to the internal refugee population, approximately 2 million. And while direct participation in Colombian state terror sharply escalated, U.S. participation sharply escalated as the new era was dawning, goes back much further, crucially to the Kennedy administration, which advised the Colombian military to resort to what it called paramilitary terror against known communist proponents. It's a pretty broad category for anyone who knows anything about Latin America. And also initiated the arms transfers and the training that have been a prime factor in maintaining and escalating atrocities ever since. The current escalation of these programs, timed for the new era, has been very sharply criticized by human rights organizations within Colombia and elsewhere, including Human Rights Watch, also including the Latin American countries and the European Union, which have completely refused to go along with Washington's current program called Plan Colombia, but out of Washington. Well, in these circumstances, which are not in dispute, certainly not for Human Rights Watch, how can we even raise the question of failure to intervene in Colombia? The actual questions are quite different. The first question is, should the United States continue to intervene to escalate atrocities, as it has been doing for many years, primarily the last decade, when the leading perpetrators of the crimes were also by far the leading recipients of U.S. military aid and training in the hemisphere, in fact, more than half of it. Second question is, what does the present and past performance of the United States tell us about the new era that is so grandly proclaimed? Those are real questions. The invented criticism about selectivity or should the U.S. intervene, these don't deserve any comment. Well, they're interesting questions about the other cases mentioned too, into them, but they have absolutely nothing to do with selectivity. In fact, serious discussion of the two chosen examples, East Timor and Kosovo, also has nothing to do with selectivity. Serious discussion focuses on the actual circumstances. With regard to the entirely different question of the new era, critical analysis doesn't presuppose what has to be shown, namely that the United States and its allies are selective and inconsistent, but rather it asks whether this is true. Do we find selectivity and inconsistency, or do we, when we investigate the policy decisions in the case mentioned and others, or do we find consistency and no selectivity? Selectivity, but consistency. That's the question. Do we find selectivity and inconsistency, or selectivity and consistency policy? That's the policy question. The null hypothesis, certainly, in investigating any state, is that the policies are more or less consistent, as long as structures of internal power remain essentially intact and unchanged. So, for example, take, say, Saddam Hussein. We reflexively assume this rational stance. So Saddam Hussein, for example, is now offering desperately needed sustenance victims of U.S.-Israeli atrocities in the occupied territories. We do not criticize Saddam in this case for inconsistency and selectivity in his dedication to human rights. Well, I won't try to establish that the null hypothesis is correct with regard to ourselves as well. I think it's quite strongly supported by the factual record, which is quite interesting and revealing. But the point I'm trying to make is a much simpler one, that these questions are not on the agenda of respectable inquiry. They cannot be raised with regard to our own actions, of course. In the case of others, we readily examine these questions and we rightly dismiss the rhetorical posturing. For ourselves, however, a discussion must be based on the presupposition that our leaders carry out humanitarian interventions, but do so inconsistently or improperly. And this presupposed but not demonstrated inconsistency merits criticism, Human Rights Watch argues. Although the world should hardly deny a helping hand to people facing mass slaughter simply because it might not act to stop similar atrocities elsewhere. That's the conventional response to the invented question, and it is certainly correct. It's much easier to refute senseless questions that one invents than to deal with the actual ones, harder. Well, again, as in the case of Mill, I want to make it clear that I'm not presenting this as a criticism of Human Rights Watch. On the other hand, on the contrary, they deserve great praise for their investigative work, and in fact, even for the comments I've just been quoting, which are unusual in their effort to address the issues without hysteria and wild charges. Quite unusual. That's why I chose this example in reference to much easier targets. Rather, the point I'm making is that even the most serious commentary on the part of those who really do have a worthy record in defending human rights apparently finds it difficult, maybe possible, to face the critical question. And it even goes on to ask whether we should intervene to defend human rights in places where we in fact are intervening massively and have been for a long time to exacerbate atrocity. So if you want to intervene, the obvious place to intervene is in Washington and New York. But somehow that doesn't arise, at least if you're concerned about human rights. Well, that last failing is quite remarkable, astonishing insight into the nature of the intellectual culture in which we live. And it's remarkably widespread. So just as, in fact, as Human Rights Watch has expertly documented, among many others, some of the worst atrocities and ethnic cleansing of the 1990s have taken place within NATO itself, in its southeastern corner. It's relying on decisive support from the United States, which has provided 80% of the arms, and not for strategic reasons, but to crush the resistance of the miserably oppressed Kurdish population of Turkey. One indication of this is the timing and the scale of the arms flow. The arms flow increased very sharply in 1984 when Turkey's military operations against the Kurds began, and it remained high and peaked, in fact, just as U.S. foreign policy was entering what's called its noble phase. In 1997 alone, arms transfers surpassed the entire period from 1950 to 1983. As the war against the Kurds escalated, Turkey became the leading recipient of U.S. arms, U.S. military aid. That's apart from the perennial leaders, Egypt and Israel and Egypt, in a separate category. For a time, also El Salvador surpassed Turkey, achieved the lead when its own human rights violations were escalating under the tutelage of the leader of the new era. Well, in 1999, the year that allegedly opened the new era, Colombia replaced Turkey as the leading recipient of U.S. arms. So one might ask, is it merely coincidental that U.S.-backed Turkish atrocities and repression had by then largely succeeded at an enormous human cost, while U.S.-backed Colombian atrocities and repression had not succeeded? Now, that happens to be a long-standing and much more general correlation, a fact that's been quite well documented and really takes some effort to miss, an effort that incidentally succeeds to a level approximating 100%, as again you can demonstrate to yourself. Well, the invented charge of selectivity is commonly countered by invoking the principle that Kosovo is special because NATO cannot tolerate the slaughter of innocents on its own doorstep. President Clinton's words reiterated by many others, who, however, failed to add that NATO is quite happy to tolerate the slaughter of innocents inside the door, indeed to contribute massively to escalate the slaughter of innocents. Actually, that failure again approaches 100% as far as I can determine. And the discipline is really remarkable. I think a dictator of a totalitarian state would be quite impressed by the achievement. So take, for example, the NATO anniversary, 50th anniversary, in April 1999 in Washington. It was a somber event, not a celebration. The reason was it was held in the shadow of ethnic cleansing near the borders of NATO, which began following the NATO bombing and the invasion threat. There's plenty of commentary about it. I couldn't find a word about the somber event of far more extreme ethnic cleansing within the borders of NATO, not outside them, thanks to the decisive contribution of its leader, and with no outside threat whatsoever. Atrocities that could easily have been mitigated or terminated simply by withdrawal of participation. Equally remarkable at the very same time was the near total evasion of mounting atrocities in East Timor. Again, a level well beyond anything reported in Kosovo, and far more criminal in character, not to speak of 25 years of near genocide and responsibility all through it, tracing back directly to Washington and London, once again in 1999, and in early 1999, accompanied by very explicit warnings by Indonesian generals that much worse was to come if the population did not succumb to massive terror. These are only a few of the events of 1999 that are not only shocking in themselves, but that bear directly on the elevated rhetoric about our commitment to principles and values expressed at the same moment for the first time in history, and its far-reaching import. From the fact that they are consistently ignored, we can learn quite a lot about ourselves if we choose, and quite a lot about the likely character of the actual new era. Well, there's by now a substantial literature on what is described as, quoting now, some of the most fundamental issues in contemporary world affairs, the responsibilities of outsiders when terrible abuses of human rights are taking place within other countries. That's John Stuart Mill's hard question. So we must face the difficult dilemmas of intervention that confront democratic governments in the face of brutalities beyond borders. Actually, I'm quoting from the best of any current academic collections, which as always focuses on Kosovo, which has the advantage that at least in that case, we're mostly talking about crimes that somebody else committed, and therefore it's a proper topic of investigation. However, one will search in vain for discussion of the dilemmas of termination of participation in atrocities, maybe because there aren't any such dilemmas. And although it's transparent that the simplest way to mitigate or terminate atrocities is just by withdrawing your participation in them, that's a window that had better not be opened, and it isn't opened, or conclusions will be drawn that are not exactly flattering, and that again tell us a lot about the real era it's opening, which happens to be the old era that's been there for a long time. Well, outside the West, these questions are a dominant concern. It's here inside the enlightened states that they can't be raised or understood. Outside, it's common. For example, the Declaration of the South Summit, again, quoting it, firmly rejects the so-called right, which it doesn't quote, so-called, quote, right of humanitarian intervention, which it regards as old-fashioned imperialism in the traditional guise of self-righteous moralism. And condemnations of NATO's bombing were extremely bitter from the start in the world's largest democracy, India. Same was true elsewhere, even in the most loyal client states, right in the mainstream, in fact. Well, maybe these criticisms are misguided or worse, but that has to be shown, not presupposed. And it hardly seems the wisest course, or the most honorable one, to enclose ourselves in a shell in which we listen to nothing but our own mutual admiration, tempered with criticism of flaws and alleged inconsistencies, always begging the most important questions. Well, these comments just barely skim the surface of the crucial issue of sovereignty in the system of nation states, and I'd like to pursue them further, but it's getting late, so instead I want to turn to another set of questions. The issue of sovereignty in the socioeconomic arena. Okay, here the relevant framework is not just, there's a variety of power centers. Among them, the most powerful states, the international financial institutions, an array of mega corporations. They're tending towards oligopoly in major sectors, heavily reliant on state power to socialize cost and risk and to maintain the dynamism of the economy. These power concentrations overlap pretty closely with the self-designated international community, but perhaps a better term for them is the one that's used by the international business press, namely masters of the universe. I'm quoting the Financial Times, the leading international business journal, describing the Davos conference last month. Well, since the masters of the universe profess to be admirers of Adam Smith, we might expect them to abide by his description of their behavior. He was referring to what he called the principal architects of policy of his day, namely the merchants of manufacturers of England, who made sure, he said, that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of England, as they pursue the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. Over time, corporate management has been granted the rights of immortal persons by radical judicial activism by people who call themselves conservatives, and has been granted rights far beyond those of persons in recent international economic agreements, for example, in NAFTA provisions that allow private power centers to attack government regulations as what's called tantamount to expropriation. They may harm future profits. That's under new doctrines of regulatory taking, they're called, which are enshrined in the trade treaties. Again, the product of radical activism by self-described conservatives. This is part of a growing assault against popular sovereignty, that is, against democracy. The assault is likely to become even more severe in the coming months as the provisions be released finally of the free trade area of the Americas. They're scheduled to be made public in April at the Summit of the Americas after several years of negotiations by trade ministers and corporations. about which the public knows virtually nothing. In a further assault against classical liberal principles, these enormous systems of unaccountable private power assume the role of administering markets, including intra-firm transfers, which are mislabeled trade, outsourcing strategic alliances, and an array of other devices to evade market discipline. Well, these are matters that are of great concern outside the ranks of the masters of the universe, including their own home countries. The Declaration of the South last April was very largely devoted to condemnation of the rules imposed by the masters. I'll give you a few examples. It insists, and then I'll quote the conclusions. It also develops the points. It insists on the right of developing countries in exercise of their sovereignty and without any interference in their internal affairs, to choose the path of development in accordance with their national priorities and objectives. It views with alarm the recent unilateral moves by some developed countries to question the use of fiscal policy as a development tool, reiterates the fundamental right of each state to determine its own fiscal policies, reaffirms that every state has the inalienable right to choose political, economic, social, and cultural systems of its own without external interference. It calls for respect for the right to development and for reformulation of policies and options on globalization from a development perspective. Those of you who are familiar with these things know that the calls are specifically directed to Washington, not only because of its leading role in establishing the rules, but also because it stands virtually alone, United Nations totally alone, in formally opposing the central principle, namely the right to development. The U.S. has repeatedly blocked resolutions at the United Nations on the right to development. The resolutions, their wording closely paraphrases Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is therefore effectively vetoed, which is entirely natural, because that's consistent with the extreme U.S. relativism with regard to the Universal Declaration for the last 50 years. Much talk about third world relativism, but anyone who looks can see right away that the U.S. has always been the leader of the relativist camp. In fact, dismisses the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration as what Jeane Kirkpatrick called a letter to Santa Claus. Well, recall that the South Summit is mostly the voices of third world elites. A far harsher critique can be heard, say, from the 10,000 or so people who attended the World Social Forum at Porto Alegre in Brazil at the same time as the Davos meetings. They represented major popular organizations from much of the world, but none of these voices reach threshold here. One might ask why right-wing governments, these right-wing governments that so strenuously object to the rules, why'd they agree to accept them in the World Trade Organization negotiations, for example? Well, one reason is that highly privileged sectors, small sectors within them, will indeed benefit. It's a traditional imperialist arrangement. An additional factor is discussed in a recent report of the Brookings Institution on these topics, which explains, citing high-level U.S. trade officials, that the developing countries, some poor countries, they did not have a choice between the new rules and some other regime. Rather, they had a choice between, quoting, between the new rules and the U.S. trade representative. That means either take the new rules or face Washington's ability to coerce the poorer countries by unilateral non-tariff barriers. So take it or else. That's enough of a reason to take it. There have been large popular protests, huge ones in fact, in the South against these international economic regime ever since its beginning, many years. They are easy to ignore as long as they're in the South. They become harder to ignore when the rich countries join in, as has happened in the past few years. In the United States, despite near unanimous articulate support for these so-called free trade agreements, or as the Wall Street Journal has sometimes called them, free investment agreements, despite overwhelming support, the population remains stubbornly opposed, and that's recognized. The journal, for example, observed unhappily that opponents of these arrangements have what they call an ultimate weapon, namely the general population, which therefore has to be kept in the dark about them as much as possible. Rather well. The occasional breakdown of these doctrinal controls has caused very deep concern. So the business press quotes veteran trade diplomats who warn that it's becoming, quoting, harder for negotiators to do deals behind closed doors and submit them for rubber stamping by parliaments because of rising public resentment that has terrified governments. Really a tragic development. In this case, too, one might ask why public opposition remains so high. After all, it seems kind of odd in an era when it's called globalization has led to unprecedented prosperity, so read all the time, particularly in the United States with its fairy tale economy. Why are people objecting? It is indeed conceded that there are some flaws. A few people have been left behind in the economic miracle. Well, again, it's useful to look at the factual record. Globalization, meaning international economic integration, that increased very fast during the 19th century, before World War I.